Hello and welcome to the History of Video Gaming. My name is Ben, and joined with me this week and every week is my good friend Wes. How you doing, Wes?
Doing pretty good, Ben. Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you, man. So this week and every week, we're going to talk about video games in chronological order. We're going to be playing some, we're just going to be glancing over some others, but this is going to be a long road trip, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff that I've never even heard of, never even thought about, but it's going to be a great journey to see the whole evolution, getting to what we started with to what games we have today. Yes.
Before we kind of get into ourselves, I want to quickly talk about sort of what we're doing, what we're trying to do. So basically, I've done a lot of research, and I've been trying to compile a timeline of video games in chronological order as they were released. Starting with the very first game, which is a little controversial, we'll talk about it, but all the way up to current day. And we're going to be sort of looking through the list and picking out anything that looks interesting or that we think might be historically significant and spending some time talking about them. So today we've got 14 games that we're going to be at least mentioning, but every week Wes and I are both going to pick 2 games that we're going to spend a little bit more in-depth time on and take a look. I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, it's going to be an awesome opportunity.
Yeah. So that's sort of what we're trying to do. Some of the main sources I've been using for this, obviously Wikipedia is a massive source. I'm not going to just discount it, but I've been going into, the footnotes of Wikipedia to the actual legit sources and trying to find some other things to help make this list, but hopefully it's accurate enough. I feel pretty confident at least about the first few episodes. I think it's going to get a little bit more challenging later. But yeah, this should be pretty good. So before we actually get into the list, Wes, why don't you tell everybody sort of what kind of games you like, what you're looking forward to playing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I'm sort of all over the place when it comes to games. Tend to not play a ton of strategy stuff, but a lot of RPGs, some MMOs, shooters, definitely. A lot of story-driven games that I like. And been playing a lot of Sekiro recently, the new From Software game, and really loving that. It's fantastic. Yeah, it's still got the themes of the Dark Souls stuff kind of going on, but different spin on it. Combat's more exciting, and there's actually a story there that's easy to follow, which they don't usually do.
I'm glad you're liking it. I know you're a big fan of those Dark Souls.
Yes, yeah. It's not usually one for the super challenging gameplay, but those ones pulled me in, and this one's a little bit more my speed, and I'm getting pretty good at it, I think.
I feel like you say that, but then you also play like FTL, which I think is pretty challenging and stuff.
That's true. Yeah, I'm kind of just slamming my head against the wall when I play a lot of those like roguelike kind of games. But yeah, so maybe I do like to torture myself with games more than anything else. But
I'll remember that when we get to Super Meat Boy.
Oh, good. Shouldn't have said anything. But as far as what I'm looking forward to in this series playing, I've never really played any of the old school Metroid, Castlevania, Metroidvania genre building kind of games. So I'm really excited to take a look at those because they've inspired a lot of the new games too that are coming out, and I've played some of those.
Yeah, and actually speaking of, I've never played Super Metroid. That's definitely something I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, that might be one that if it's on when we get to it on the list, we both might have to take a look at that one.
I'm sure there's going to be a couple games like that.
Be envious of the other person if you were the only one who got to play Mario or whatever.
I know. I probably should leave Mario to you since I've played it so much. Yeah. A little bit about me. I don't know. I kind of play games and then I kind of get bored of them and I move on. So because of that, I really like single player games, like RPGs, like Skyrim or something, but I never finish them. So it might be good to try to finish an RPG or something.
It's just such a huge world. You get halfway through and you're like, God, I still have 30 hours left or something.
I know. Maybe, I'm sure some of the earlier games are just more main story driven, not as many side quests, and they're probably going to be better for me. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, I like to play like strategy games, anything with a lot of replayability value, like Civ 5 or something like that, I'll play over and over and over again. RTS like StarCraft, I'm a big fan. I do play some shooters, some platformers, but I'm kind of all over the place with them. Some, I don't know. I wouldn't consider myself a good like shooting sort of gamer, but I enjoy
a good RTS player.
Yeah, good RTS player. I'm good at StarCraft. I'll say that much. But yeah, I think that's a little bit about us. So hopefully, I mean, we're going to be choosing both the big games on the timeline, but also like little games that you've never heard of. So don't worry about us, skipping over your favorite game. I'm sure we're going to hit it. So without further ado, why don't we jump into the timeline? All right, welcome back. So we're going to jump into what could possibly be defined as the very first video game ever created. Now, this is all the way back in 1947. Can you imagine that? 47.
It's just insane to me that there's even anything resembling video games back that far.
I know. So we're starting off with the cathode ray tubed amusement device, which is quite a mouthful. Now, before any of you start posting comments, I'm not saying this is the first video game ever made, but some people consider it to be. Okay, we'll talk about sort of as we go through what we might consider to be the first video game ever made. But some people consider this to be the first because it was a video game. However, it's got some downsides. Number one, it was never made. Pretty big downside. It was just a patent. But the game kind of revolved around sort of an arc projectile simulator, kind of like Angry Birds or something like that. But we're going to leave it as an honorable mention just because it was never made. So obviously we couldn't really test it or leave a rating or anything like that.
Right. And the same thing goes for the next one that we have in our honorable mentions list, which is Turo Champ. It was a chess simulator, but it was also just starting to get developed by Alan Turing before he passed away and wasn't able to finish it. So the main thing about it is that it was able to think 2 moves ahead, and it was really considering the same thing. This is 48. I don't know if I mentioned that, but just 1 year after you had a cathode ray tube amusement device, and making something that could already think 2 moves ahead in a game that has a rule set like chess, it's kind of insane.
Yeah,
and it was also the first one to have sort of a simulated artificial intelligence and digital memory.
I mean, even though I would probably not consider it to be the first game because, again, it wasn't made, it started involving technology that would become common in everyday games. Which is,
it
definitely
really has
worth mentioning.
Absolutely, yeah. It has a framework for kind of everything that's going to come after it.
Yeah. All right, and with that, I think we're going to move to the first game that I actually took a look at very seriously, which is a game called Bertie the Brain, which came out August 25th, 1950. So before I get into Bertie the Brain, I just want to quickly mention how we're going to rate the games. So right off the back, I want to say all ratings will be based on today's standards, with the idea being that a good game will hold up no matter how old it is. And I've played quite a number of old games that I think do hold up. So I'm pretty confident in that. But we've got 4 categories we're going to rate stuff in. One's going to be gameplay / fun. The other is sound and music, graphics / aesthetics, and finally what we're going to call relevance, which is really how much did this impact the history of video gaming. And it could do that either by being popular or influencing somebody who went on to make something popular, or had the first use of AI like the last game. But for Bertie the Brain, this is one I wanted to take a deeper look at because I feel like this is an actual game that was the first to actually be developed and played by somebody. So this is a sort of mainframe computer game that was showcased in, I believe, a World Fair.
Sounds about right. I think that's where a lot of them were.
Yeah, that's where, and it was really used as just sort of to show people what a computer could do, because a lot of people, had never seen a computer, thought it was just like a calculator. And Bertie the Brain, you could actually play against it, and it would make different moves depending on what you did. Kind of building on the AI from the chess game we had just talked about. However, I feel like there's also some negatives to it that, also kind of make it not a video game. For example, it had light bulbs in the back that were kind of shaped like zeros or X's. So it didn't actually have a display. It would just turn on a light bulb depending on where you picked, which is kind of interesting. You could play as either X's or O's, and the computer would take the opposite, which is pretty cool. It also had a win light that would come on once it knew that you won, which I think is a pretty big thing for the first ever sort of game.
Right, even though it's just a sort of proof of concept for like, hey, look, a computer can do this. They're also like, we want to make sure you get some applause for winning.
Exactly, yeah. And it actually had a couple difficulty settings as well. I mean, Tic-Tac-Toe is not a very complex game if you studied it. Like the guy who made it, who was that guy? Joseph Cates.
He's better than I do.
Yeah, he's like a mathematician, right? So they know how to win tic-tac-toe, by just having some simple formulas and stuff. But I mean, I feel like it had a lot of like first in video gaming history. The first to have a difficulty, the first to display if you won, the first time you could like actually play a game, as opposed to just the patent that we had talked about earlier. So I really wanted to look at it. I did play several tic-tac-toe games in preparation for this podcast, and I will say tic-tac-toe is not a very fun game. Compared to today's standards, I wouldn't play it for more than 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm going to say, if I would rate this, the gameplay is like 1 out of 10. It's kind of like preschool game or something, There's the replay value once you know how to beat the computer pretty low. I'm gonna say. For sound, it didn't have any sound. As you will find out listening to this podcast, almost all the games that we're going to be talking about this episode and the next few episodes have no sound. So I can't give it anything higher than a 0 because it didn't have any sound. Graphics, I think, I gave it a 1 out of 10 because there aren't really graphics. But I actually think seeing the light bulbs light up would actually be pretty cool to see in real life. I mean, this thing was massive, right? It was probably like 10 feet tall. So these light bulbs are ginormous. I feel like a really big like casino machine or something. I feel like,
wow,
if you were to play it. So I think it would actually be kind of cool. But I gave it a 1 out of 10 because, they're not moving. It's just X or 0. It's just, on or off. But I think it could be cool. And then finally for relevance, I have 6 out of 10 because although I would argue it's not the first video game because it doesn't have, sort of a graphical display, just as light bulbs, it had a lot of firsts in video gaming. And although I think it's not remembered as being very influential in terms of gameplay or game design, the technology behind it was certainly influential. So I would say, I think 6 out of 10 is right where it should be. And that kind of gives Bertie in the Brain a total score of 2 out of 10, which I feel pretty good about.
Yeah. I mean, with everything you said, it kind of makes sense to me. And again, we're doing this looking at it from a modern scoring rating. So, I mean, It doesn't mean it's bad or not worth playing. It's just, that's kind of how we see it, as like that 2 out of 10 or whoever ended up playing it.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to think about this when it came out, I'm sure anybody who played it were just mystified by how it worked. They would at the time say it was a 10 out of 10.
Right.
But, knowing what comes later and what is yet to come, it's really, just a stepping stone in terms of video gaming history that is important and I want to talk about. But, from the idea behind the rating system is, if you were to go back and play this game right now just for fun, how fun would it be? And I don't think tic-tac-toe would be that fun. But maybe I'm in a minority there. I don't know.
Who knows? This podcast could be listened to by exclusively tic-tac-toe fans.
I hope so, because they're gonna really love this one. So why don't we continue? How are you feeling about Bertie the Brain, Wes?
It sounds a lot real similar to the one that I played in a lot of ways, and I'll get into that when I cover it. But it's pretty interesting. I'll watch a video on it. I don't know if I'll play it, but I think that's my level right now.
I'll quickly. So we have one honorable mention before your game, Wes. So let me talk through that one. In 1951, 1 year after Bertie the Brain, the first chess game was released for the Ferranti Mark I mainframe computer. It was a 2-move-ahead chess problem, just like Alan Turing's that he kind of thought up 3 years beforehand. But it did not have a display, so it would literally print off what move. It would be like the computer would print a piece of paper that said rook e4 or something like that, and then you would have to move the piece on an actual chessboard. So probably not a video game, although it was playing against an AI who could think 2 moves ahead in chess, so probably pretty good, better than an average person, I would guess. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm just imagining it takes 5 minutes to print out or something.
It does take a long time, a very long time.
Sitting there wondering, you're like, I think I got him, and you're like, God damn it, knight to E whatever.
Unfortunately, there was no emulation for this, so we couldn't play it or test it, so we just left it as an honorable mention. It is pretty interesting. Another chess game. People really want to play these sort of board games. Why don't you tell us about in your next game, Wes?
Yeah, so the first one I got to cover was similar to Bertie the Brain in that you're playing against a computer, and the whole pretty much aspect of the game is this computer, which was called Nimrod. Same thing, was sort of presented at I don't know if it was a World Fair or if it was a World Fair being held in Britain. It was a British fair, I know that.
We know the important. It was Britain.
Yes, yeah. And it played a game called Nim, which is a very confusing, to me at least, coming into it with just kind of getting thrown in and reading the instructions. It's a mathematical game, and the way I played it was just an emulator that was basically showing a little JPEG, whereas if you had actually played it at the fair, it would be similar to the one that you were talking about, Ben, and it would just show up different lights to show what moves you were doing, and they would all illuminate or turn off based on whatever move you made.
Okay.
And it's would be a turn-based thing where you're going against Nimrod, and I don't want to get too far into it because I'm going to talk myself in circles if I try to explain it. But basically, you can set how many buttons or dots are lit in a row, and then you start the game, and you can eliminate dots in each row, and the goal is to be the last person to remove the last light, if that makes sense, which it still doesn't to me.
So how many lights are there total?
I think you can go up to a maximum, there's 4 rows, and you can go up to a maximum of 7 lit when you start the game, but they don't all have to be lit when you start the game. So it's interesting because it has sort of a variable start condition, and the computer adapts to it each time. So, I thought I was being smart, and I was like, if I do 5, 6, 4, 7 for the number of lights lit in each row, maybe the computer won't figure it out. But it did, and I think I have a record of maybe 1 win and probably about 25 or 30 losses.
Man, take that win.
Yeah.
Wait, so how many? So why don't you just take all the lights away at the very beginning?
If you take all the lights away at the very beginning, there's 4 rows, so you can only take the lights from 1 row at the very beginning, or at a time.
Oh, okay.
And since it's 4, if you're going first and you take away all the lights, then inevitably the computer gets the last turn, basically.
I see.
And I looked up some formulas on it. I was thinking maybe I'd get pretty good at it because people have solved equations specifically to beat Nim, however it starts.
Okay.
And I think after looking at that I was inspired, and that's how I won my single game of Nim.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it sounds like a very formula sort of. I can see why like a mathematician would pick it.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to misquote, but I'm pretty sure it was made by a mathematician, or at least someone who was very heavily involved with math, and that's seems like a theme with a lot of these early ones, because it was at some point, I guess, less about the game and more about showing what these computers could do, and the fact that they could compute all these mathematical equations and play it.
Right. I know I've seen like board game versions of Nim, but do you happen to know if this was like a game that was like popular at the time?
I didn't really.
People knew how to play.
I don't know if. I'd be interested to look that up, because I don't think Nimrod created Nim. Yeah, so it must have been around beforehand, but I actually didn't end up looking up if it was a popular physical game before it was represented through Nimrod.
Right. Okay. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up after, because that's a good question. But now I'm just gonna, unless you had anything else you wanted to cover, move on to the ratings.
I do have one other thing I wanted to ask you.
Absolutely.
So Bertie the Brain plays tic-tac-toe, right? It sounds like your game is a lot more complicated, but after learning how to win, do you think it's still as complicated as or more complicated than tic-tac-toe?
I think there's a lot of possible moves depending on how you start.
Okay.
So it could just be because, tic-tac-toe has been kind of in the periphery, in the back of my brain since I was little.
Mm-hmm,
but to me, it seems like it's a lot harder to solve.
Okay.
To someone who has the knowledge of it, it might be super simple once you figure it out.
Okay. I'm just interested to see, how technology has improved, because this is coming out almost a full year later than Bertie the Brain.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. It depends on, I guess, how Bertie the Brain interpreted the data. But I know for this, people were saying it's kind of read light on or off as binary.
Oh, okay,
so I don't know if it was super complex, but maybe being able to anticipate and decide on a next move was really complex at the time.
Yeah, I think Bertie the Brain's similar in that way, but just not. It only has a couple options, honestly.
Right. Yeah.
Compared to Nim, it sounds like Nim has a lot more going on.
Yeah, I was definitely overwhelmed, if that says anything.
All right, why don't you tell us about your rating?
Yeah, sure thing. So for graphics, I kind of went the same way you did. I just ended up giving it a 1 out of 10. There's no display in this game, but the lights did show up just on this big machine that they had. The version I played was just a image file that changed. So, but for the original game, I think I'd give it a 1 out of 10.
Okay.
Sound, nothing going on other than the clicks of the little switches that you would be switching in real life. So probably give it a 0 out of 10 there. And for gameplay, along the same lines, if you learned it, I think you wouldn't really be able to do much more with it. You'd probably beat the computer every time.
Mm-hmm.
It does have a different mode where it changes the win condition, which is interesting, called a reverse Nim, but I don't know when that was implemented, if it was in the original game.
Okay.
So for the gameplay, I gave it a 1 out of 10. And relevance, I gave it a 5 out of 10, because just the fact a computer was able to do this at that time, to me, seems pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And overall, I think same thing you gave yours. I decided that a 2 out of 10 probably represented it best if we're looking at it from today's standards.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because it's interesting to me that you gave gameplay 1 out of 10, which is the same thing I gave Bertie the Brain, because it seems like it's a much more complicated game, but also because of that, it's harder to play,
Yeah,
I
so
feel like it's one of those things where technology improvements doesn't mean better game almost,
And for some people it might be a better game, but for me the barrier to entry was a little too high, so that might have affected my score a little bit.
I know. I briefly looked at it before I gave it to you, and I gave up real fast. I was like, I don't know what's going on. These lights are popping up. I've got different lights. I don't know. And no matter what I did, the computer always won because it knew it.
Exactly. That's what happened to me too, except for one time, which I will put on a plaque and carry around for the rest of my life.
I think you should. All right. Why don't we get into the next one? So the next one is another game I spent quite a lot of time with, which was the very first checkers game. And the reason I wanted to spend time with this one and not just leave it as an honorable mention is because it was the first to have a digital display. Now, some people will say XOX, which is an honorable mention for us, was the first to have a digital display because they both came out around the same time. But from all the sources I've looked at, it seems like checkers came out first, developed by Christopher Strachey sometime in 52. And I think there's quite a lot going for checkers. Not only is it way more complicated than tic-tac-toe, which was the other one I was looking at today, but everything about it, I feel like it's just an improvement. Like, we actually have a digital display. I'm not sure exactly how it does it. It looks like pixels, but I'm sure it's not pixels. But it would actually, it wasn't just a light bulb turning on and off. There was some sort of mechanism behind displaying this that would show you X's or O's for the different colors, and then sort of like boxes, and then blank space for the actual board. And it even would change certain characters into like a K if it was like a double checker, or
oh wow,
yeah, it was pretty advanced, honestly. The one thing I will say is the game, although it's more complicated, it also was apparently filled with bugs and would constantly error and crash. So take that with a grain of salt, I would say. But it was a full-fledged checkers game, and although it took a long time for the computer to make a move, it would update the display once it made a move and could play a full game of checkers from beginning to end, including getting rid of the pieces, knowing when it was over, and like I said, getting I forget what it's called. I'm just going to call it a king, but it's like when you stack two checkers on top of another.
Yeah, I don't know the name either, but that sounds close enough to me.
Yeah. By the way, this game is called Draughts because that's what checkers are called in England, which apparently England has been a pretty hot spot for the early part of video gaming history for right now. But I should also mention, like, right around the same time, another programmer came out with his version of checkers, and let me just double check what his name was. His name was Arthur Samuel, right around the same time, sometime in 1952. Unfortunately, we don't have great dates for this stuff. If it wasn't like at a world fair, it's kind of hard to know. Which this wasn't. It was developed like as in a college. It's part of like a educational experiment / paper. And then, by the way, I don't know, we should have probably mentioned, but almost all the games we've talked about so far, as soon as they're done being built and showed to the public for the fair, they're like immediately destroyed. So Bertie the Brain isn't around. The original code was lost. I think Nimrod was the same. Do you happen to know, Wes?
I think it was destroyed pretty soon after, but they did make a replica, and I want to say 68 of it.
Okay.
But there was just kind of like 10-year dead zone where it was gone. Right.
Yeah, and I'm sure they probably could use like notes and stuff to get a pretty good accurate replication, but the originals for a lot of this stuff just aren't around. So the same thing goes with checkers. I couldn't find the original version of the emulation to test this, but I did play several checkers games just to remind myself how it works and sort of remind myself how fun the game is itself. Which I feel like, I don't know, I feel like the game is fun, but it's more fun with a friend. If you're playing against a computer and the computer has no emotion about what it's doing or what has happened, it's not as fun.
Right, yeah, it's part of the experience is yelling "I got you" at the person when you beat them, or
right,
they have this trick up their sleeve and they get you with it.
Or like when you make a move and then the other person was like, I'm so glad you made that move, and then they destroy you,
Right.
It's like the computer doesn't care, it will just do it. And you just feel bad. But I gave the gameplay a 2 out of 10. I think it's better than something like tic-tac-toe. It definitely has a lot more variety, and you can play it a lot in a lot more different ways. However, I did have to consider the fact that the game will crash or something if there's like too many kings on the board, or it's something happened. It's not like the best coded game of all time, but I think a 2 out of 10 is kind of where it should be. The game had no sound, so that's still 0 out of 10. And for graphics, I actually said 0 out of 10. I think it's worse than Bertie the Brain, because at least Bertie the Brain, you could like take one glance at it and know what was going on. But with Checkers, the screen is pretty small and pretty like filled to the brim with stuff. And it's just like black and white, right? Dots. And you're looking at O's and X's and K's, and they all represent like checkered pieces, which don't really look anything like those. So I thought, I don't know, I think the graphics, even though it's the first time to use digital display, which that'll give it points into the historical relevance, how it did that, I don't think was a good use of the technology, in my opinion.
Right, like the implementation at the time, what they were displaying wasn't really helpful. It was a little overwhelming, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it to, like, keep in mind we're judging this by today's standards. I think by today's standards, people would kind of get lost into what's going on and not be able to follow it. I certainly know when I was looking up sort of screenshots and videos of this, it's really hard to pay attention. And, even the earliest forms of like revisions of this changed the graphics pretty dramatically to make it look more like the actual game that we know from the board game. But finally, for relevance, I give it a 7 out of 10, because I do think, having the first ever truly digital display is something to really be celebrated, because, up until this point, we've just been using light bulbs, and a lot of people would say that's not a video game. It's more sort of electromechanical flipping of switches and stuff. But this was an actual digital display, and in my mind is sort of the first video game in history. So 7 might actually be even a little bit low, but considering all that's led up to this point, it's not like the first game to invent all the technology. It was just sort of that one last step to making it become a video game proper, in my opinion. So right. In total, 2 out of 10 I gave Checkers. That's the Christopher Strachey version in 1952 that came out.
Yeah, it's incredible what this whole thing's kind of blowing my mind what people were able to do, and having that digital display in 52.
Yeah, I know. I mean, what else was happening in 52? I don't know, but
you're gonna quickly show that I don't know my history very well if we get into that.
We're very particular when it comes to history.
Right. So should we move on over to the rest of our honorable mentions?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so the next one that we had also in 52 was called OXO, and you touched on it a little bit already, but it's tic-tac-toe again, but this time has a CRT display, which the coding was implemented right, probably a big improvement over Bertie the Brain and how it's showing you're playing tic-tac-toe.
Yeah, it actually
apparently played pretty well too.
Yeah, I just want to add in. I believe Checkers use a CRT display. I'm not positive about that, but certainly both games look like they use the same display. I don't want to go on record and say it was, but...
Right. Well, we're on record now, so...
Oh, dang it. Got me.
And one of the reasons that we weren't able to play this one, along with some of the other ones on our list, is that this was never really made available for public use. And the next one that we covered was the Rancor military simulations, another one that wasn't available to the public and was developed by the Air Force. And it was also in 1952, and basically it was a flight path simulator.
Yeah, so that one, I mean, you have to keep in mind, like, computers in general were sort of developed for the military at the beginning, so even though World War II is over at this point, the military is still interested in knowing what computers can do, and so military simulations like this were being developed as far back as 1952. Our next honorable mention is Pool, and I want to I want to spend a little bit of time on Pool. We didn't cover it in full, but Pool's the first game to use moving graphics that moved in real time, which is pretty incredible. This came out in 1954, and it was developed at the University of Michigan. Now, we didn't review it proper because there's no emulation. It was never made available to the public, and we only know about it from, I believe, newspapers at the time posted an article about this game. And that's all we have. We do have screenshots. But apparently, you had a pool stick. You would pick the angle, click a button, and then a ball would, you hit your cue ball, and the cue ball would bounce against the other balls, and there wasn't holes on the edge of the pool table, so the balls would just disappear in the corners. But it was the first game to have moving graphics, and I think it's until your next game, there are no other games that have moving graphics.
Wow.
And your next game came out in 58, so this is 4 years prior, so a really big accomplishment. However, it was kind of just a tech demo or something made for, a specific person made for themselves. So unfortunately, we don't have great records of it. And then the next honorable mention I want to talk about is Checkers. I know I already talked about Checkers, but this is Checkers developed in 1955, 3 years after my last Checkers sort of talk. And I didn't want to cover Checkers again, so this one was developed by Arthur Samuel, however, and this one is important because it was the first to use machine learning. So basically how it did this is, I think it would look at checkers, and then out of all the possible moves to make, it would have like a sort of weighted average of which one would be the most likely to produce a win, and then sort of if it won or lost, those averages would change. So it wasn't like machine learning like it was learning from you. It was more kind of taking an average of what happens whenever I do these moves and changing them as the game played. So I feel like it was partly mathematical sort of based, where I feel like those things could be just written out as a formula, but rather than give the computer the formula, it kind of made the computer to like figure out the formula for itself, which is very interesting. And obviously machine learning will become incredibly important in the history of gaming. So I did want to mention that in 1955, people were already thinking about it. Arthur Samuel with his game Checkers.
It's insane. And so the next one that we had to cover also in 55 is Hutspiel, I believe is how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
And it's a military sim that was developed for studying the use of nuclear weapons for the army. And another one that, developed for the military, not available to the public. Mm-hmm. And after that, I guess there was multiple iterations of it between 51 and 58, is chess upgrades, just multiple versions of attempting to play full games of chess. None of the ones that were created in this time frame were ever really able to get above the amateur level, but with each iteration they're getting faster and more complex.
Yeah, and I should mention, like, when we say they're getting faster, like the first chess game, which was the 1951 chess game, we're talking like 25 to 30 minutes for it to make a move. We're getting down to like 5 minutes now.
Man, that's speedy.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting that chess and checkers and tic-tac-toe, it seems, kind of were iterated upon by multiple people throughout the 1950s, all the way to 58. And then we've got one more honorable mention before Wes does his final game review, and that is a game called The Management Game. And this is our first text-based game. It doesn't have a display, and so it kind of just prints out the text of what happens, and it's kind of a logistic training simulator where I believe, I want to say it had something to do with, like, for example, you've got 50 truckloads of wheat and 5 need to go here, 5 need to go here. What is your decision? Or, how much wheat do you put on a truck and stuff like that. So I don't think there might be emulation for the game, but As far as influence, not very influential. It was just sort of the first text-based game to come out in 58 and was more an educational tool than an actual video game.
But any manager who played it must have been top tier. I mean,
I don't know about that, but maybe.
Logistics were on point and very easy to plan around for anyone else who played the game.
I feel like it was more like if you watch like a training video when you get a new job, it was basically that.
Right. Except you might be able to say A or B and then choose what happens next. But.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
As we'll find out in future episodes, the early text-based video games were extremely like complicated and more for like experts in the field. So definitely not something for the average person. The management game in 58.
All right. So the second one I got to cover is actually, compared to the other stuff we're looking at, I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. Oh, and before we start, I should mention this is the last video game for today's episode. So.
Oh yeah. So we're going to be wrapping it up with this one, and it's this one is in October of 58. Yeah, and we hope you enjoyed it. And any way you can, let us know how we're doing. Yeah. But for this one, it was in October 18th of 58. I have a pretty exact date for that of when it came out. Unfortunately, I didn't really get a chance to play a really accurate emulation of it. One I tried to download, but the emulator was missing files, and the other one was just a kind of publicly shared one that pretty much represented it, but it was very slow and laggy, which oddly enough, I guess because of the way that this one was displayed, it in the videos I watched on it looked like it was pretty responsive.
Right. And what's the game called again?
Tennis for Two for this one.
Tennis for Two.
Yeah. Great name too. It really rolls off the tongue.
It does.
But this was kind of, you think of it as an early precursor to Pong. You're two people playing and they're hitting a ball back and forth between each other. And I was really amazed for the time that it's simulating arcs, and people had controllers that they could use to pick the direction that they wanted the ball to go. So it seems like it really had a lot of things that it was the first, or at least the first one we covered, that had like controllers and like a real sense of multiplayer. I think Nim had multiplayer, but it was implemented later, as far as I know, not in the first version of it. Mm-hmm. And also it's kind of following the line of taking board games that you like and making them into games, and then this one's taking a sports or taking a sport and making it into a sports game. And it's obviously going to be first in a long line of sports games that are now a huge part of gaming.
That's true.
The visuals for this were on a oscilloscope, which I don't fully understand. Looked up a little bit. I think it has different ways to display light at different parts on the screen, and that's how it was able to simulate the movement of the ball. And the person who created this based it on a computer that was made that was able to simulate trajectories of objects with wind resistance, although this one didn't actually have any sort of wind resistance calculated into it, as far as I know.
Okay.
And then I was going to move on into ratings after that. Do you have anything else you wanted to ask about it?
So is it like, how do you play it? Like, is it like Pong where the ball comes and then it bounces off like a wall that you control?
So there wasn't a wall on the screen. I think as long as it was in your zone, you could hit it. So just whether or not it was past the net.
Okay.
In the video I was watching, people were there's nothing to represent your character, so I guess you're kind of guessing. But they were hitting the ball back like real close to the net, so you didn't have to wait for it to get to the edge of the screen.
Oh, that's kind of, yeah. Oh, does it? I guess if it hits the net, it's over too. As
far as I know, yeah. The emulator I played, the net was, you could hit through it. So
maybe not. I don't know.
But in this version, it might have. I feel like it had it, but in the video, it mainly showed people scoring by it bouncing, multiple times on their side of the court.
And then you mentioned, I don't think any of our other games we mentioned today have their own dedicated controller. I mean, something like Bertie the Brain had like a control board where people would press buttons, but it wasn't like like a controller that we would think about today.
Yeah. So I mean, this is really starting that idea of someone having a controller that they can use instead of being attached to the system.
Right. And what, it had a button to hit the ball back, and
Yeah, it was a button to hit and then a little dial that you spun, like a volume knob almost, to indicate the direction you wanted to hit it.
okay, that's pretty cool. So you could spike it if you wanted.
Yeah, I think you could. Probably got people competitive about games too, which I don't know if, of course, with like the board games, they made the board game versions of them, that was starting to arise, but then this brings the sports into the mix in that competitive aspect.
That's true. And with it being multiplayer, it's going to be real intense in there.
Yeah. And also the start of the idea of shared experience with video games, which I don't know if we're seen much of before.
Very true. Yeah.
And so for the ratings that I had for it, the graphics I gave a 2 out of 10 because it's actually showing the ball move, which I thought was another thing that's just crazy when you're thinking about the time that it happened.
Yeah. So, I mean, other than Pool, I think this is the only other game that had moving graphics up until this point. Definitely very... It's got to feel like an advanced feature at this point, you know, still.
Yeah, it seems pretty revolutionary, and I'm sure it was amazing at the time to watch.
Yeah.
And then for sound, there wasn't too much going on. It was a mechanical machine, so there was lots of different clicks and everything else, but I still gave that a 0 out of 10.
Yeah, and let's play a clip of that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then for gameplay, gave it a 2 out of 10, just because there's not too much going on, but of course it is, since it's multiplayer, it's gameplay and how much you enjoy the game also kind of depends on the person you're with, so it's sort of a variable thing. But for me, I thought it was around a 2 out of 10. Mm-hmm. And I bumped the relevance way up there and gave it an 8 out of 10 because I think it's really innovating on a lot of different things with having controllers, multiplayer, and also being a version of a sport represented in a video game format. So I think it really had a huge impact on games.
Yeah, and if I remember right, I think I remember reading that it was the first video game made like for entertainment purpose.
Yeah, exactly. I'd forgotten about that point. Yeah, but it's the first one where it's, you know, this is a game for people to have fun with, not just something to show off how cool computers are or whatever else.
Yeah, so it definitely deserves all the attention that people give it, for sure. I would say of all the games for today's episode, this one is the one that, if you want to go back and play and see what an old-time game made in 1958 looks like, look up a video for Tennis for Two, because it's pretty crazy, honestly.
Yeah, definitely the favorite one I played today.
All right, I think with that so let me sort of try to recap what we covered. We covered a lot of time. 1947 with the cathode ray amusement device patent, all the way up until 1958 for Tennis for Two, which came out October 1958. So this is episode 1, and what's going to be a 3-part episode on the early history of video gaming before we get to our first console. But I hope you enjoyed it. By the time this episode airs, we should have like a website, which we'll talk about in the next episode, where you can see the timeline itself, and hopefully we'll have a Twitter as well, so you can reach out, let us know what you're thinking, if you're playing any of these. If we missed anything, please let me know. I try to do as much research as I can, but some things will always get missed. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for tuning in. We're signing off.